Hi, in this video I'm going to be showing you how to make a kilo of sourdough bread. And this recipe comes from the owners of Sunrise Mill in North Branch, Minnesota. I took a class from them and they had learned how to make sourdough bread from a bakery in France. So this is a traditional 3-day sourdough bread. And the flour I'm going to be using is the pizza dough from Sunrise Mill, and it's a sifted flour. It's a heritage organic sifted flour. And it works really well for this bread. So what I'm going to do first is show you how to feed your starter. So my starter has been in the fridge for a few days. I'm going to take it out. This is my starter, and starter can stay in the fridge for up to 7 days before you need to feed it again. As soon as you bring it out on the counter, you need to be feeding it every 24 hours. So I'm going to show you what it means to feed the starter. Okay, so what I need to do is find a similar jar so I can tear out the weight of the jar. So I have a similar quart jar, and I'm going to tear out the weight, and I'm going to put it on grams. This recipe uses grams for measurement. Okay, so I've teared out the weight. Then I can put my starter on there and it will subtract the weight of the jar. It's 223 grams right now. That is too much for me, because once I feed this, it's going to double in size, and that's going to be too much starter for me. So I like to keep it, if it's over 200, I usually like to dump some out. So I'm just going to dump some out into my garbage, which, you know, you could use your starter in recipes instead. And I do, I use it to make pancakes. But sometimes you just have to get rid of some. So I'm just dumping a little out. Okay. And let's see where I'm at. 177 grams. Okay, so now when you feed the starter, you have to double it in size. And half of it is in water and half of it is in flour. So I'm going to prepare some water. Water should be filtered and about 70 to 85 degrees. I tend to go more towards the 85 degrees. So I just kind of always have hot water on hand. And I just add some hot water to my cold water, and I use my thermometer. I'm at 72, so I need to go a little bit more. You don't want to use hot water straight from the tap, and really you should be using filtered water anyways. Okay, so I'm at 80 degrees, which I'm fine with that. So that's my prepared water. I have 177 grams of starter, so I want to take half of that weight for water. So half of 100 is 50, half of 77, or here we're at 76, 38. So 88. Is that right, Joe? Okay, 88 grams. So I'm going to tear it out again so that I can measure the 88 grams. My scale is a little tricky. Okay, and I'm going to go 88 grams. You gotta go kind of slower than you think, because sometimes in the beginning you might overfeed it. Okay, I went to 89, that's okay. Now I'm gonna tear it out again, because now I want to add the flour portion. So I'm gonna do 88 of flour also. So tear it. Okay, and now I have my flour. And I'm just gonna get like a little stick here. And then I do 88 grams of flour. Okay, now I need to stir it. I like to use these spurtles to stir. They're nice and firm, and they stir really well. So I just kind of like scrape down the sides and then just kind of stir to incorporate it all. As you can see, the jar gets kind of messy, and so every week or two I do put my starter in a new jar. Okay, so that's pretty good. Then what I do is I cover it, and I usually put a sticky note on the top saying what time of day I fed it. So I'm just going to do that real quick, because you want to feed every day around the same time. So I'm just going to write AM, like for morning, because I either do AM or PM. So now I will leave this on my counter, and as long as it's on my counter, I have to feed it every 24 hours. So every morning. It doesn't have to be exact. Like it's about 9:45 today. It doesn't have to be exactly 9:45 tomorrow. It could be 8 AM or whatever, but about every 24 hours I need to feed this. Now you can see that I have a lot. I've doubled it in size. So there's a lot of starter. You don't need much to make a loaf of bread, as we'll see next. You only need a little bit of this starter. So it may have been better to get rid of more of the starter before I fed it, but you can always use extra starter for pancakes and things like that. So this starter needs to stay on the counter for at least 12 hours before you start making a loaf of bread with it. So in our next step, we'll see how you do that, but it has to stay out at least 12 hours to get activated. So I'll meet back here in about 12 hours and I'll show you the next step. Okay, it's been about 12 hours and my starter is now active and bubbly. You can see it's very much alive. So it's ready to start a loaf of bread. The first step in making the sourdough bread is to make a levain, and that's like a French word for like a ferment that is basically, it's just the first step in making a loaf. So what we need to make this levain is 25 to 35 grams of starter. So I just put a bowl on my scale and tear it out. And sometimes I do use more than 35 grams if I'm just trying to get rid of some starter. It doesn't really affect the bread in a bad way. So here's 35, perfect. So that's 35 grams of starter. Then we put in 100 grams of water, and the water again is about 80 degrees, and I've already gotten my water the right temperature. I just used the tap water and added some hot water until I got 80 degrees. So I'm going to tear it out and do 100 grams. Okay, there it is. And then I also do 100 grams of my flour. So I tear it out, and then I add 100 grams of flour. Okay. So then I just stir it, and I use this same tool that I used this morning. All right, and then when it's stirred, just cover it with a plate. And now it just needs to sit for about 12 hours until we do the next step in the process. So it's nighttime right now, so in the morning it'll be ready to do the next step. Sometimes when I'm on a different schedule, I make my levain in the morning, and then in the evening I make the loaf of bread, so about 12 hours later. But then sometimes I'm too tired at night to make the bread, so one option is to, after this levain has been sitting for a while, you can put it in the fridge like overnight, and bring it out the next day, and then go on to the next step. So basically it needs to stay on the counter for about 12 hours. if it's going to be more than 12 hours, you do have the option of putting it in the fridge and bringing it out, if that works better for your schedule. So we'll wait till morning and we will make our loaf of bread. We are on day 2 of making sourdough bread. Yesterday we took the starter out of the fridge and reactivated it. We fed it, and then by evening it was nice and bubbly and we made a levain out of it. So now we are at the next morning. Here's my levain, and you can see it's very nice and bubbly. That's the start of a loaf, which we will continue making today. And then I also have my starter that I fed yesterday morning. The rule is that if your starter is out of the fridge, you have to feed it every 24 hours. So it's been 24 hours, I need to feed it again. And I'm gonna show you what I do when my jar gets really messy. So I'm gonna actually move my starter to a new jar, and I'm not gonna keep very much of it because I have a lot of starter here. You can see, like, this is kind of a lot for me. Unless I'm gearing up to make pancakes or something, I really don't want that much. So I'm going to tear out my new jar, and I'm just gonna put in, you know, maybe like 100 grams. That's kind of a good amount for me, because once I feed it, it's gonna become 200 grams. All right, so that's good. And this I'm just going to throw out. So I'm actually at 107 grams here. So to feed it, remember I double it in size using half water and half flour. So I'm going to do 53 grams of water and 53 grams of flour. And I tear it out each time. It's 53 of water. And then 53 of flour. So make sure your scale is always set to grams. Sometimes if there's a little too much, I just scoop out a little. It doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, and I'm just going to stir that up. So I have a nice clean jar. So I like to do that when it starts just getting too messy. Now, since I don't plan on making bread in the next few days, I'm going to put this back in the fridge so I don't have to feed it every day. So the rule is, when you bring it out of the fridge, you feed it right away, and you have to wait at least 24 hours, feed it again, and then you can put it back in the fridge if you want to put it back in the fridge. So I'm going to put it back in the fridge, and then it can stay in there for a week before I feed it again. But you could take it out in a day or two, whatever. You can take it out whenever you want. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my levain. So this is what we made yesterday. It's like the first step in making a sourdough loaf. And today we're going to actually it's going to make 2 loaves. We're going to make them, but we're not going to bake them. Tomorrow we will bake them. So what we want to do is put our bowl on the scale and tear it out. And we're going to be adding 500 grams of water and 800 grams of flour and a tablespoon of salt. So you want to add the water first. So 500 grams of water. And again, I have measured my water to be about 80 degrees. And you want to be careful because once you get it in there, you really can't get it out easily. Okay, 500 grams. Now to add my 800 grams of flour, I usually do it in 2 groups of 400 with a little salt between, just to mix in the salt a little better. So I tear it out, and I'm going to do 400 grams. And then I'm going to add a half a tablespoon of salt, because I'm going to add it in 2 groups. So a half a tablespoon of salt. And then I'm gonna tear it out again and do another 400 grams of flour. Okay, and then my other half a tablespoon of salt. So again, that was 500 grams of water, 800 grams of flour, and 1 tablespoon of salt. And I just split it up a little differently, but that's what it added up to. And now I'm just going to stir this. And this, I use this nice tool from Mad Hungry, Sourdough. It works really well. So we're just going to get it all stirred together into a ball. And then we're just going to let it sit for an hour or two before we knead it into 2 loaves. So right now I just want to get it incorporated into a nice ball. This tool works really well. You could use your hands, but it's really sticky at this point. So I like to use the spurtle. And just kind of roll it into a ball. Just going to go up and over. And it's looking pretty good. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is just cover it again. And I'm just going to let it sit on my counter for about an hour or two. And then we'll come back and we will knead it and put it into 2 loaf pans. My bread dough has now been sitting on the counter for a few hours, and you can see that it has raised a little bit, not a huge amount, but if I were to wait a few more hours it would be much more raised. It doesn't need to be super raised. This is fine. So it's been about 2 hours. We're going to knead that in a second, but first I'm going to prepare my loaf pans. So I use the Pampered Chef stoneware, which I really like, and I am going to just grease them. I never wash these between my batches of bread. That's how I was taught, just to leave it, so I never wash them. And I just use coconut oil, and I use just a plastic bag so my hands don't get all greasy. And I just grease them with some coconut oil. Okay. Then I do my kneading in this kind of shallow pan, but you could use cutting board, breadboard, or whatever, the countertop, whatever works for you. I put a little flour in the bottom of my bowl. And then I use a bread scraper like this to scrape the dough out of my bowl so I can get it all. It works pretty well. And I put it in my kneading bowl. And then I can just kind of scrape the rest of the dough out of there. Okay. Then it helps to wet your fingers to knead, so I wet my fingers, and then I'll show you how I knead. I kind of do a fold and a whip, a fold and a whip. So I kind of roll it or fold it and then whip it. So I do the whole ball for a while. Then I use my scraper, the flat side, and I cut it in half. So I'm going to have 2 lobes. So I just put one over there, and then I'm just going to knead one of my balls for a while. The same thing, I'm just folding and whipping. And it kind of feels like this one might be smaller than usual, so I'm just going to grab a little dough from my other one. After a while you get a feel for how much dough you should have. they're always the same size. That's okay. So I don't know, maybe I did this 20 times. I don't really count, but just do it for a while. And it looks pretty good. I just make kind of a little loaf shape like that, and I put it in my pan. So that's the first one. And then I do the same with my other one. Get my hands wet. And do about 20 fold and whips. So good. And again, just make a little loaf shape, put it in the pan. And they look pretty equal actually. And then what I do, these are going to go in the fridge and be covered in the fridge for overnight. And then tomorrow we'll bake them. So what I do is I put them in these plastic bags. You could just cover it with plastic wrap if you wanted. I like these because I can kind of billow up the bags because they will rise a little bit in the fridge. And you could wait 2 days in the fridge. It will get more sour the longer it stays in the fridge before you bake it. Usually I just let it go one night in the fridge and bake it the next day. So I just kind of billow it up like that and I'll put it in my fridge overnight, and then tomorrow we will bake them. Okay, we are on the third day of making our sourdough bread. Today's the day we will bake our bread. My loaves have been in the fridge overnight, and I'm going to pull them out of the fridge. And I'm going to remove the bags that are around them. And you can see that they have kind of spread out a little in the pans. But they haven't really rose very much. So I'm going to leave them on my counter for a few hours before I bake the bread. And I'm just going to cover it with a cloth and let it come to room temperature, and the warmer temperature will help it rise more. So I'm thinking that maybe in 2 hours I'll bake the bread. If I had left the bread in the fridge for 2 days before I brought it out, it would be much more risen and probably be pretty close to, I could probably bake it right away. But because it's not very risen, I'm going to wait a little bit. So maybe 2 hours, and I'll preheat my oven to 450 before I'm ready to bake it. So we'll return in about 2 hours and see what it looks like. My bread has been sitting on the counter about 2 hours. It's not a super warm day in the house, so it didn't rise a lot, but it should be okay. In the summer, you'll see that it will rise a lot quicker. What I do next is I take a knife and I score it on the top just a little bit. Just like that. And then my oven has been preheating. It's at 450 degrees. And I'm gonna put these in the oven. And I cover it with, this is what I use to cover it. It's just a pantry chef. I don't know if it's actually a cover, but I use it like that. It's gonna go 35 minutes. After 35 minutes, I'm gonna take the cover off and let it go 8 more minutes. So we'll check back in 35 minutes. It's been 35 minutes. So I'm gonna just take off the cover. And you can see the bread has risen some and is getting brown. And then I go 8 more minutes, but you kind of have to figure out how your oven works and play around with it. It may require less time or more time, and also depending on how you're covering it will affect how long you bake it. All right, 8 minutes has passed. Our bread should be done. Let me grab it out. And then I put it immediately, you can see it's a little brown on top. I put it immediately on a dry rack, or a cooling rack. Also, I was told when I learned how to make this that it should be about 200 degrees. So if you wanted to check to see how your oven's doing, you can check, and yeah, mine is right. So so after you bake it, if it's not 200 degrees, it probably needs to go a little bit more depending on your oven. So this needs to cool and we can eat it. I still have starter in the fridge, so when I'm ready to make bread again, I bring it out and I start the whole thing over again, feed it, make the levain, make the loaf, and bake it. So that's it. Okay, it should be pretty cool, ready to break into. Just gonna cut myself a little piece. Need some butter on there. Good stuff.